She walked into that town meeting with nothing but a worn notebook, and the truth, and every man in that room went silent. Vernon Clay, the most powerful land broker in 3 counties, had spent 6 months trying to break Samuel Pryor. He had choked off the water. He had starved the supply lines. He had done everything a man with money and no conscience could do. And now he stood at the front of that crowded hall, certain of his victory. He had not counted on Martha. He had never counted on Martha. What happened next would change everything for the valley, for the ranch, and for 2 people who had stopped believing anything good was still coming their way. Drop your city in the comments below and stay with me until the very end. This one is worth it. The lie burned worst on the days her hands were already cracked. Martha Calloway had learned to work through it. She had learned to work through most things. She dipped the shirt into the rinse bucket, wrung it hard with both hands, and draped it over the wooden drying rack without letting herself look at the rawness creeping up from her knuckles. Looking at it only made it worse. She had found that to be true of a great many things in life. It was a Tuesday in late October, and the air coming off the mountains had turned mean. The hotel sent its laundry in 2 large bundles every Monday morning, and Martha had been at the washboard since before the sun cleared the ridge. Her brown hair, shot through now with threads of silver she no longer bothered to hide, was damp against the back of her neck. The yard behind her rented room smelled of wet wool and ash water, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking at nothing in particular. Millhaven was a town that had made up its mind about Martha Calloway 4 years ago, and had not seen fit to revisit the decision. She heard them before she saw them. 2 women from the Methodist circle, Mrs. Aldridge and her constant companion, Mrs. Fitch, walking along the far side of the alley with their market baskets. They did not stop. They never stopped, but they slowed just enough, and their voices dropped into that particular register that was somehow louder than speaking plainly. "Still taking in wash," Mrs. Fitch said. "What else is she to do?" Mrs. Aldridge replied. It was not a question. Martha kept her hands moving. She had gotten very good at that, at keeping her hands moving, while the rest of her went somewhere else entirely. She thought about the hem she needed to stitch on the last shirt in the pile. She thought about whether she had enough salt pork to last through Friday. She did not think about what those women meant when they said, "What else is she to do?" though she knew exactly what they meant. They meant that a woman who could not keep her husband was a woman who deserved whatever narrowness life handed her afterward. Thomas Calloway had left in the spring of 1881 with a wagon company heading for Oregon. He had told Martha he was going ahead to scout land and would send for her. She had believed him for 8 months. After that, she had stopped waiting for the letter that was never coming and started taking in laundry to cover the rent on the 2 small rooms above the feed store. The town had decided, in that quiet and thorough way towns do, that Thomas had left because of some fault in Martha. No one had ever said it to her face in so many words. They did not need to. It lived in every averted glance, every conversation that stopped when she entered the dry goods store, every pew that somehow stayed empty beside her at Sunday service. She had 2 choices as she understood them. She could leave or she could stay and refuse to shrink. She had chosen the second because she had nowhere particular to go, and because something stubborn at her core would not let those women have the satisfaction. The morning wore on. She finished the hotel's shirts and started on the tablecloths, beating them against the washboard in a rhythm that had become as automatic as breathing. Her shoulders ached down to the joint. She was fuller figured than the women who gave her pitying looks, broader through the back and hips, and 4 years of heavy washing had packed a dense, capable strength into her arms that she would not have traded for anything. It was honest strength. It was hers. She was wringing out the last tablecloth when she heard the gate behind her. Mrs. Calloway. She turned. Gerald Pratt, who managed the hotel for its owner over in Cheyenne, stood at the fence with his hat in his hands. He was a thin man with a trimmed mustache and the look of someone who had already rehearsed what he was going to say. "Mr. Pratt," she said. He cleared his throat. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Mr. Harmon has arranged with the laundry service out of Castor Creek to take over the hotel's account. They came in considerably lower on price." He paused. "I want you to know it was not my decision." Martha looked at him for a moment. The wet tablecloth dripped into the dirt. "When does the arrangement begin?" she said. "End of the week." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Calloway." "Truly?" She nodded. She thanked him. She waited until he had gone back through the gate before she set down the tablecloth and pressed both palms flat against the edge of the washboard. The hotel account had been half her income. The other half came from 3 private families who gave her small bundles, irregular, never enough on their own. Without the hotel, she would be short on December's rent by the 2nd week of November. She ran the arithmetic the way she always ran arithmetic, quickly and without self-pity. And the numbers did not improve no matter how many times she added them. She straightened up. She put the tablecloth through the wringer. She finished the work that was in front of her because that was what you did. By afternoon, she had walked to every house on the respectable side of Millhaven. She had not rushed. She had worn her clean dress, the gray wool one with the repaired collar, and she had knocked on each door with the same steady hand. She asked if they needed a laundress. She asked if they needed help with heavy cleaning, with preserving, with any task that required more hours than the household had. She was willing, she told each of them, to discuss terms that suited their budget. Mrs. Hensley said she had all the help she needed, thank you. Mrs. Dawes looked at her with something close to pity, and said she would think on it, which meant no. The widow Carmichael told her plainly that her daughter-in-law did for her now, and she had no call for outside help. At the Greer house, a girl of about 12 answered the door, saw who it was, and called back into the house in a carrying voice, "Mama, it's the washerwoman." Martha heard a hushed exchange, and then the girl came back and said her mother was indisposed. Martha said she hoped Mrs. Greer felt better soon. She said it without irony. She walked back through the center of town, in the long afternoon light, her good shoes, raising small puffs of dust on the unpaved street. She had enough pride left to keep her chin level and her pace even. Inside, the arithmetic ran and came up short. She sat down on a low stone wall at the edge of town, where the road bent away toward the open country, just to rest her feet for a moment. The mountains to the west were catching the last of the sun, going pink and then amber above the dark tree line. It was a beautiful view. Martha had always been able to appreciate a beautiful view, even when everything else was in poor order. 2 men were talking on the other side of the wall, leaning against a fence post, their voices carrying in the dry air without them being aware of her. "Pryor's place is sitting empty most of the time now," the first man was saying. "Heard he let his last hand go in September." "Man's too stubborn to hire decent help," the second said. "It ain't stubbornness, it's the location, 12 miles out, and no neighbors to speak of. Women won't go. Men don't want to be that far from town." A pause and the sound of a match being struck. "He was asking around again last week. Needs someone to cook and keep the house through winter. Said he'd pay fair. Reckon you'd have to pay more than fair to get anybody out to that valley. Mitom his problem," the first man said, and they moved on. Martha sat on the stone wall for a long while after that. The sun finished going down. The air turned cold and sharp. She thought about 12 miles of open road. She thought about a house that needed keeping, She thought about the rent coming due and the 3 families who gave her irregular bundles, and the hotel account going to Castor Creek. She had always believed that Providence did not waste hardship. It applied it somewhere specific. She got up off the wall and walked home to pack a bag. She spent that evening asking quiet questions. At the feed store, she learned that Samuel Pryor had come to Millhaven 8 years ago from somewhere in Kansas, had built up a cattle operation in the Garnet Valley, and had been farming that land alone since his wife departed for her sister's home in Denver some 3 years past. The feed store man said it with a careful neutrality that told Martha all she needed to know about local opinion on that subject. She did not ask for further detail. She said thank you and bought a small paper of dried beans and walked home. She knew what it was to be the one who got left. She reckoned Samuel Pryor knew it too. That night she sat at her small table with a candle and wrote out her accounts one more time. The numbers were what they were. She was a practical woman, and practically speaking, she was out of moves in Millhaven. Whatever waited at the end of that 12-mile road, it was at least a different answer than the one this town had been giving her for 4 years. She packed her carpet-bag with care, her wool skirts, her work aprons, the small Bible her mother had given her at her wedding, which she had kept out of stubbornness more than sentiment, the tin of dried herbs she had been cultivating since spring, the worn notebook she used for accounts. She folded everything neatly the way her mother had taught her, because how you packed your bag said something about how you intended to arrive. She was not going there to beg. She was going there to work. But what she could not have told you sitting at that candle-lit table in her 2 rented rooms above the feed store was why the thought of 12 miles of open country and a silent house in a valley felt less frightening to her than one more Sunday in that church pew with the empty space beside her. She blew out the candle. She lay down in the dark. She did not sleep for a long time, but when she did not dream of Millhaven at all. She was at the livery before first light, her carpet-bag in hand, asking about the cost of a ride out to the Garnet Valley. The liveryman, a red-faced Swede named Gunderson, scratched the back of his neck and named a price that took most of what she had in her coat pocket. She paid it without flinching. As the wagon rolled out of Millhaven, in the gray early morning, past the hotel where she had washed linens for 3 years, past the church with its familiar white steeple, past the stone wall where she had sat and heard 2 men talking about a valley too far for most people to bother with, Martha Calloway did not look back. She had made a decision. She intended to find out what it was worth. What she did not yet know was that 12 miles away a man was standing in a cold barn in the dark, listening to the wind come through the gaps in the wall, and wondering if anyone was ever going to come. The road out of Millhaven was not much of a road. Gunderson drove without talking, which suited Martha fine. She sat on the wagon bench with her carpet-bag between her feet and watched the town fall away behind them, the false front buildings going small and then disappearing entirely as the road curved south and the land opened up on all sides. The change was immediate and total. One moment there were fences and yard dogs and the smell of coal smoke, and then there was simply the country, vast and pale gold. In the early light, the grass bent over by the same wind that was working its way through Martha's wool coat. She had not been outside the town limits in over a year. She had forgotten how large the sky was out here. The mountains ran along the western edge of everything dark with pine, above the tree line their peaks carrying the first snow of the season, like a dusting of flour on dark bread. To the east the land flattened and kept going until it blurred into a horizon that looked too far away to be real. Between those 2 extremes the road wound south through rolling grassland, crossing 2 shallow creek beds where the wagon wheels went loud on the stones, climbing a long, gentle grade and then dropping into a draw, thick with cottonwoods gone yellow with the season. Gunderson spoke once about 4 miles out. He said, "You got family out this way." "No," Martha said. He nodded and did not ask anything further. She was grateful for that. She was not in the habit of explaining herself to people, and she had not yet worked out exactly how to explain this particular decision, even to herself. She was going to a ranch owned by a man she had never met to ask for work she had not been offered on the strength of two men's conversation she had overheard from the other side of a stone wall. Set out plainly like that, it had a reckless quality. She preferred not to examine too closely. What she examined instead was the country. It was rough and spare, and it did not apologize for itself. The grass was the color of dried hay now, but you could see in the lay of the land in the depth of the creek beds and the dark line of the cottonwoods that water moved through here in its season, and the ground remembered it. There were cattle in the distance, a loose scatter of dark shapes against the pale grass. And once a hawk rode the wind directly overhead, close enough that she could see the rust color of its tail. Martha had grown up on a farm in eastern Nebraska before her father sold it and moved the family to a Kansas town where everything smelled of the stockyards. She had not thought of that Nebraska land in years. Something about the smell of the grass here brought it back now, the clean mineral smell of open ground. And she felt something in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. The wagon dropped into the Garnet Valley just past the 9-mile mark. She understood at once why prior tenants had turned back. The valley was beautiful, in the way that lonely places often are. A creek ran along its eastern edge, lined with more cottonwoods, and the grass in the bottom land was deeper and greener than anything on the surrounding plain. The ranch building sat on a low rise above the creek, a large barn of weathered gray wood, a smaller outbuilding in the house itself, a 2-story structure of rough-cut timber that had never seen paint but had been built with an evident solidity, the kind of building that intended to stay. Beyond the buildings, the valley narrowed and the mountains moved in closer, and the whole arrangement had the quality of a place tucked away from the main current of the world. There was no other structure visible in any direction. 12 miles back to town, no neighbors, no noise except the wind and the creek and a dog that had begun to bark from somewhere near the barn. Martha picked up her carpet bag. "Much obliged for the ride," she told Gunderson. He looked at the ranch and then at her with an expression she could not quite read. "You want me to wait," he said, "in case he ain't hiring." She considered it for only a moment. "No," she said. "I'll be fine." He did not look entirely convinced, but he took her coins and clicked his tongue at the horse and turned the wagon around. She stood in the yard and watched him go back up the valley road until the cottonwoods took him. Then she turned to face the house. The dog had come around from the barn, now a big brindle cattle dog with a working dog's lean build and serious expression. It stopped 6 feet from her and regarded her without barking. "Good dog," she said in the same tone she used for most things level and without excess. The dog's tail moved once. She heard him before she saw him, the sound of boots on hard ground, a particular heavy and unhurried tread coming from the direction of the barn. And then Samuel Pryor came around the corner of the outbuilding, and Martha Calloway got her first look at the man whose land she had traveled 12 miles to reach. He was tall, she noted first, broad through the shoulders in a way that came from years of physical labor, rather than any particular gift of birth. He was somewhere in his middle 40s, she guessed, with dark hair, going gray at the temples, and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into a collection of deep lines around the eyes and at the corners of his mouth. He was wearing canvas work trousers and a flannel shirt that had been washed many times, and his boots and the lower half of his trousers were thick with the dark mud of the creek bottom. He had been moving cattle this morning. She could tell by the set of his shoulders that he had been doing it since early and was not yet finished. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her the way a man looks at an unexpected thing in his yard, not with alarm, not with welcome, but with a straight and measuring attention. His eyes were dark gray, she noticed, and they moved from her face to her carpet bag, to her hands, and then back to her face in a way that was not impolite, but was entirely direct. "Help you," he said. It was not quite a question. "Mr. Pryor," she said, "my name is Martha Calloway. I've come from Millhaven about the housekeeping position. I was told you were in need of someone, and I am in need of work. I cook well, I clean thoroughly, I can put up preserves and manage a kitchen budget, and I am not troubled by solitude." She paused. "I would ask that you judge me by what you see in front of you and not by what you may have heard from town." Something moved behind those gray eyes. It was not pity, and it was not amusement. It was closer to recognition, the look of someone who understood the particular weight of being preceded by other people's opinions. He said, "What do they say about you in town?" "That I couldn't keep my husband," she said. "He went west with a wagon company 3 years ago and didn't send for me. I expect the version you'd hear in Millhaven is somewhat different from that one." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved through the cottonwoods down by the creek, and the dog sat down between them in a companionable way. "Man's a fool," Samuel Pryor said, and she was not certain at first whether he meant Thomas or himself or some general category of man, but his tone was flat and factual, the tone of a man stating something he considered obvious, and she found she did not need to clarify it. "Can you start Monday?" he said. "I can start now," she said. For the first time, something at the corner of his mouth shifted. It was not quite a smile. It was the faint adjustment a man makes when something surprises him in a way he approves of. "Come on, then," he said. The house was in a state that Martha recognized immediately and without judgment. It was not dirty, so much as it was neglected, the way a place gets when one person is doing the work of keeping a ranch alive and has nothing left over for the smaller matters. The kitchen table was clean, but the windows were filmed with dust and grease smoke. The fireplace in the main room had a winter's worth of ash in it. The curtains, plain cotton, had gone gray with age and could stand a wash. There were boots by the door and tack hung on a peg near the stairs, and a coffee pot on the stove that had been used so many times without proper scouring that it had taken on the color of the coffee itself. Samuel showed her the room at the end of the upstairs hall. It was small, with a single window facing the mountains and a narrow bed and a washstand. There was a hook on the back of the door and a braided rug on the floor, and the window glass was clean, which she noticed. "Suit you," he said from the doorway. "It suits me fine," she said. "Thank you." He told her the wage. It was fair. It was in fact somewhat more than fair, and she was careful not to show the relief that moved through her when she heard the number. "I eat breakfast at 5:30, he said. "Dinner when I can get to it. Supper at 6, if the work allows." He paused. I don't require much in the way of conversation." "Neither do I," she said. He nodded once, and then he went back downstairs and out the door, and she heard his boots cross the yard toward the barn. The dog followed him. Martha stood in the small room for a moment. The mountains were visible through the clean window, close and quiet. The only sounds were the wind and the creek, and distantly cattle. She set her carpet bag on the bed and opened it with steady hands. She had packed for work. There was plenty of it here. She started with the kitchen, because the kitchen was where a house began. She found the cleaning supplies in the lean-to off the back door, and she set about the stove and the windows, with the focused efficiency of a woman who had been cleaning other people's spaces for years, and knew exactly where disorder hid. She scoured the coffee pot until it was honest again. She found a smoked ham in the cold cellar and dried beans on the pantry shelf and cornmeal in a tin, and she had supper started on the stove before the afternoon light had shifted more than 2 hours. When Samuel came in at 6 o'clock, stomping mud from his boots, on the back step the kitchen smelled of ham broth and fresh cornbread. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the stove, and then at the windows, and then at the table where she had set 2 places with the plain dishes she had found in the cabinet. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Much obliged. Sit down." "Bet," she said. "It's ready." They ate across from each other at the kitchen table, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was simply quiet, the quiet of 2 tired people eating a hot meal at the end of a long day. Outside, the wind had picked up and was working around the corners of the house, and the fire in the stove knocked and settled. Once he said, "Ham's good." She said, "There's more." He took more. After supper, he went to the main room, and she washed the dishes and banked the stove. And when she carried a cup of coffee through to where he was sitting, he looked up from the account book open on the table beside him with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite gratitude, but held something of both. She set the coffee down and went upstairs. She lay in the narrow bed in the small room and listened to the sounds of the valley, the creek running steadily over its stones, the wind, the distant low of a cow somewhere in the dark. It was a different silence than Millhaven. Millhaven's silence had always felt like being ignored. This silence felt like something else entirely. She could not have said what it felt like, but she pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, the arithmetic did not run in her head before she slept. Downstairs, she heard Samuel Pryor close his account book. She heard his boots cross the floor and the particular sound of a man pausing at the foot of a staircase, as if he had thought of something and then decided to leave it where it lay. She heard him bank the fire. She heard him go to his room. What she did not hear, because it was only a thing happening inside him in the dark, was the thought that crossed Samuel Pryor's mind as he lay down in the silence of his house, the thought that it had not felt so much like his house this evening as it had in a very long time. He did not know what to make of that. He was a man who distrusted things he did not know what to make of. But the thought came again anyway, and he was still turning it over when sleep took him. Martha had been at the ranch 11 days when she noticed the calves. There were 4 of them in the small pen behind the barn, separated from the main herd, and when she went to empty the slop bucket one morning, she heard the particular rough, labored quality in their breathing that she had not heard since her father's farm, but recognized at once. She set the bucket down and leaned over the fence rail and listened. The sound was low and persistent, a wet cough that caught in the chest and did not clear. She went back to the kitchen and opened her tin of dried herbs. She had been collecting and drying since the summer before last, partly from habit and partly because herbs cost nothing if you knew where to find them, and the alternatives at the Millhaven pharmacy cost more than she cared to spend. She had mullein for chest complaints, dried thyme, a small paper of horehound, and a bundle of pine needles she had gathered last spring from the lower slopes. She made a strong infusion in the large pot, let it cool enough to be safe, and carried it out to the calf pen in a bucket with a long-handled ladle. Getting 4 sick calves to drink a medicinal infusion was not a graceful process. It involved a great deal of patience and a moderate amount of getting her apron wet. By the time she had coaxed the last calf into taking a second ladleful, she was aware of being watched. Samuel was leaning on the top rail of the fence with his arms crossed. He had the look of a man who had been watching for some time and had decided not to interrupt. "They've had that cough 3 weeks," he said. "I know," she said. "I heard them on my second morning here." She wiped her hands on her apron. "I should have said something sooner. I wasn't certain it was my place." He looked at her for a moment with those level gray eyes. "If you see something on this ranch that needs doing," he said, "it's your place." She nodded. She made a note of that not in her account book, but in the more private ledger she kept inside herself, the one where she recorded the small evidences of how a person actually was as opposed to how they presented themselves. She did the infusion twice daily for 6 days. On the 7th day, the calves were quiet in the pen and breathing clean. And when she went out to check them that morning, the largest one put its nose against her hand and breathed warm air into her palm. She did not mention it to Samuel. He saw it on his own. That evening he said over supper, "Reckon you saved me replacing those 4. They were strong calves," she said. "They did the harder part themselves." He looked at her across the table. He started to say something and then seemed to decide against it, and went back to his food, but he refilled her coffee without being asked, which he had not done before, and she counted that. The second thing she did was the accounts. She had not intended to involve herself, but on a Thursday, when the wind was too sharp for outdoor work, she was cleaning the main room and found the account book open on the table where Samuel had left it, weighted down by a coffee cup, as if he had stepped away in the middle of trying to solve a problem. She glanced at it without meaning to pry, and then she looked more carefully, because what she saw told her something was badly wrong with the numbers. Samuel was not a careless man. His entries were neat, and his arithmetic was accurate, but he was paying rates at the Millhaven supply store that she recognized immediately as the rates a man pays when he has no one to negotiate for him. And he was ordering in quantities that made no sense for a single-handed operation. He was buying 10 pounds of something when 5 would do, and running short of something else that could have been substituted at half the price if he had known where to look. She sat down. She got out her own notebook. She spent 2 hours cross-referencing his accounts against what she knew about Millhaven prices and regional alternatives, and by the end she had a clear picture of where the money was going and a list of 7 adjustments that would save him a meaningful sum over the winter. She left the list under the coffee cup. She did not explain it. She went back to cleaning the windows. That evening he came in and stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a moment before supper. He had her list in his hand. "You do this," he said. "Yes," she said. She kept her attention on the stove. "Where'd you learn accounts like this?" "From keeping my own for 4 years on not enough money," she said. "You get sharp with figures when the margin is thin." He looked at the list again. He looked at her. She could feel the quality of his attention, that straight and unhurried examination, and she concentrated on turning the cornbread so she would not show him that she was aware of it. "I'll send for the feed from Castor Creek, then," he said, which was the most direct acknowledgment she was going to get, and she knew it. "Much obliged," she said. "Supper's in 10 minutes. He saved $40 over the following 6 weeks. He did not tell her this directly. She knew because she was doing the accounts by then, not because he had asked her to, but because he had stopped putting the account book away when she was nearby, and eventually that amounted to the same thing. The storm warning came on a Wednesday in late November. Martha had been watching the sky since morning. She had grown up watching prairie skies, and she knew the particular yellow-gray color that gathered at the edge of the mountains when a serious storm was building behind them, and this sky had that color. She knew the way the cattle behaved when the pressure changed the way they moved toward low ground and stood with their backs to the coming wind. The prior herd had been drifting south all morning. She found Samuel at the water trough repairing a section of pipe. "There's a blizzard coming," she said. "It'll be here before dark. You need to get the herd into the north pasture where the windbreak is, and you need to do it in the next 2 hours." He straightened up and looked at the sky. She watched his face as he read. It watched him arrive at the same conclusion she had already reached. "Reckon you're right," he said. He did not ask her how she knew. He picked up his jacket from the fence post, whistled for the dog, and was on his horse in 4 minutes. She spent the afternoon bringing in wood and filling every water vessel in the kitchen and the lean-to. She checked the calves in the pen and moved them into the barn. She brought in the tools that had been left outside, banked the stove high, and made a large pot of beef and vegetable soup from the remains of a roast and the last of the fall carrots, because men who spent hours in a blizzard moving cattle came home cold to their bones. Samuel came in at dusk, when the first snow was already driving horizontally past the windows. He was coated in white, from his hat to his boot tops, and his face was raw with cold. The dog came in behind him and shook snow across the kitchen floor without apology. She handed him a towel, she put the soup on the table, she poured coffee. He sat down and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and said nothing for a long moment. The storm hit the house full force, and the windows shook, and the fire in the stove pulled hard in its draught, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of soup and wood smoke, and the particular animal smell of a man who had been working hard in cold weather. "Got them all in," he said finally. "Good," she said. "Lost 30 head last spring," he said. "Storm came up fast." He looked into his coffee, didn't see it in time. She understood then that he was not just telling her about the spring. He was telling her something about what this afternoon had meant. She did not make more of it than it was. She said, "The sky gives you a little time if you know what to look for." He looked at her across the table. "Where'd you learn that, Becky?" "Nebraska," she said. "My father's farm." She paused. "You watch the same sky long enough, it starts to talk." Something in his face shifted almost imperceptibly. The lines around his eyes eased by a degree. "Reckon that's true," he said. The storm lasted 2 days. They were confined to the house and the close radius of barn and outbuildings, moving through the work of feeding and watering in the teeth of the wind, and then returning to the warmth of the kitchen. They developed without discussion a set of understandings about the space, who moved where and when, who handled what. The natural choreography of two people learning to occupy shared ground. He took the barn in the early mornings before she was up. She had breakfast waiting when he came in. He split wood in the late afternoon. She carried it in. Neither of them narrated these arrangements. They simply happened the way sensible things happen between sensible people. On the second evening of the storm, they sat on opposite sides of the fireplace in the main room because the kitchen had gone cold, away from the stove. Samuel had his account book, and she had the mending basket she had found in the upstairs closet, full of shirts with missing buttons and trousers with torn knees untouched for what looked like years. The fire cracked and the storm drove snow against the windows, and the dog slept on the floor between them. After a long quiet, Samuel said, "You said you grew up in Nebraska." "Eastern Nebraska," she said. "Cass County. My father had 160 acres on the Big Nemaha." "Good land." "Very good land," she said. "He sold it when I was 16. I've never quite forgiven him for it." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but held a dry recognition. "My father sold land too," he said. "Kansas, good grassland north of Dodge." He turned a page in the account book without really looking at it. Some things you don't get back. The fire settled. The storm pushed at the glass. "What brought you out here?" she asked. She kept her eyes on the mending because she had found that some conversations went better when neither person was looking directly at the other. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Fresh start," he said. The two words carried something heavy in them that he did not elaborate on, and she did not press. She said, "I understand that." She thought he might say something more. He did not. But he stayed in his chair by the fire for another hour, and he did not open the account book again. And once, when she glanced up from the mending, she found him looking at the fire, with an expression that was not quite lonely and not quite peaceful, but was somewhere between the two. The expression of a man who has been alone long enough to stop expecting company, and is now in the slow, uncertain process of revising that expectation. She went back to her mending. She did not let herself think about what that expression meant. She was here to work. She was doing good work. That was enough, and she intended to keep it enough for as long as she could manage it. But when she went upstairs that night and lay in the narrow bed listening to the storm, she found herself thinking about his hands. They were large hands, scarred at the knuckles from years of ranch work, and she had watched them this evening turn the pages of the account book with a careful, unhurried movement, and she had not meant to notice that, but she had noticed it, and now she could not quite unnotice it. She turned toward the wall and closed her eyes with some firmness. In the morning the storm had passed, and the valley was white and absolute and still. And when Samuel came in from the barn, his breath was a cloud, and his face was bright with cold. And he said, "Every head accounted for." And she felt something warm move through her that had nothing to do with the stove. She put biscuits on the table and said, "Eat before they go cold." And he sat down, and neither of them said anything about the warmth in the kitchen that had nothing to do with the stove either. But she knew it was there. And by the way he reached for a second biscuit without needing to be offered, she thought he might know it too. The discovery that something had changed came to Samuel on a Tuesday afternoon in early December, and it came to him the way difficult truths often do, through a side door rather than the front. He had come back from the south pasture earlier than expected, a thrown shoe on the roan that needed tending before he could go out again. The house was quiet when he came in the back way, and he assumed Martha was upstairs, or in the root cellar. He was halfway across the kitchen when he heard the sound from the front porch. He stopped. It was not a distressing sound. It was very small. It was the sound of someone breathing in the particular, careful way that people breathe when they are trying not to show that they are in pain. He went to the front door and opened it. Without noise. Martha was sitting on the top porch step with her back partially to the door, her legs stretched out in front of her, her apron folded in her lap. She had her right hand in her left, and she was rubbing slow circles around the knuckles with her thumb, her head bent to the work. And the late afternoon light caught the redness and the swelling that she had been hiding every morning under her sleeves when she came to the kitchen. She had not heard him. Her face in that unguarded moment was not the face she wore in the kitchen or at the supper table. It was exhausted in a way that went deeper than the day's work. It was the face of a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and had gotten very good at not letting anyone see how heavy it was, and who had come outside alone to set it down for just a few minutes where no one would notice. She was not crying. She had, Samuel thought, gotten past the point where she cried about it. That was somehow worse. He stood in the doorway for a moment that stretched too long, and then he went back inside without making a sound, and he stood in the kitchen with both hands flat on the table. He knew that kind of carrying. He had done it himself for 3 years, ever since Eleanor had taken the stage north with 2 trunks and her sister's address written on a piece of paper, and had not once written back. He knew the weight of it, and he knew the way it taught you to arrange your face so that no one would ask. He went upstairs. The next morning Martha came down at her usual hour and went to the woodpile to bring in the day's first armload, because that was how she started every morning. She stopped. The wood was already stacked inside the back door, every piece she would need for the morning fire, and then some arranged with a neatness that had nothing accidental about it. She stood looking at it for a long moment. She brought the water in next, except the water was already in. The large ceramic jug by the stove was full, and the smaller bucket on the washstand was full, and she had not filled either of them last night. She stood in the middle of the kitchen in the early dark before sunrise, and looked at the full water jug, and the stacked wood, and the cold stove waiting to be lit. And something happened behind her eyes that she refused to let go any further. She lit the stove. She made breakfast. When Samuel came in from the barn at his usual time, she was at the stove, and she did not look at him directly, and he sat down at the table and did not say anything about the wood or the water. He said, "Cold out. Might snow again by Thursday." She said, "I'll make sure we have enough broth put up." He said, "Much obliged." And that was all. But she knew, and he knew that she knew, and neither of them made the mistake of talking about it and ruining it. 3 days later, she woke before dawn to find the water jug full again and the wood stacked. And she lay in the narrow bed, listening to the creak in the dark below, and felt something shift in the bedrock of her understanding of this place. This man, this winter. She had spent 4 years in Millhaven, waiting to be seen. She had kept her chin level, and her hands moving, and her face arranged. And she had survived it, but surviving was not the same as being seen. And she had known that distinction intimately for a very long time. In this house, in this valley, with no audience and no occasion and nothing to gain from it, Samuel Pryor had seen her. He had not said a word. He had gotten up in the dark and carried water. She turned that over in the quiet for a long time. Outside the creek ran on over its stones, patient and certain, going wherever it was going in the dark. She was not fool enough to call it love, not yet, but she was honest enough to admit that it was something, and that the something had been growing since the morning she had first seen his boots outside the door and understood what they meant. She was also honest enough to admit that she was frightened of it. She had trusted a man before, and had been left standing with her hands full of wet laundry and a town full of people glad to tell her what that meant about her worth. She was not eager to stand in that place again. But here was the thing about Samuel Pryor. He had not asked her to trust him. He had simply gotten up before dawn and carried the water and gone back to his own work without a word, and whatever she made of that was entirely up to her. She thought that might be the most careful thing anyone had ever done for her. The morning she fully understood it, she was looking out the kitchen window at the first gray light coming over the mountains, and she saw the imprint of his boots in the fresh frost on the porch. Boards going to the water barrel and back laid down quietly in the dark so as not to wake her, already going cold, in the early air. She pressed one hand flat against the cold window glass and looked at those boot prints for a long time. She did not say anything to him at breakfast. She put the biscuits on the table and poured the coffee, and they ate in their usual quiet, and the dog slept by the stove, and the frost melted off the porch boards as the sun came up over the ridge. But that evening, when she set his coffee on the table beside the account book, she let her hand rest there beside the cup for just a moment longer than was necessary, close enough to his that the warmth between them was something she could feel. He did not move his hand away. He looked at the fire instead with that expression she had come to know. And the lines around his eyes were a little less deep than they had been in October. And she went back to her chair and picked up the mending, and the fire cracked and the creek ran in the dark outside, and neither of them said a single word. But something had been decided between them all the same. What Martha could not have known settling into her chair with the mending in her lap and the warmth of the fire on her face was that 30 miles away, in a Cheyenne hotel room, a man named Vernon Clay was spreading a map across a table and drawing a line with his finger that ran straight through the Garnet Valley. And that by spring. What had been decided quietly by a fire on a winter evening would be tested in ways that neither of them was yet prepared for. Vernon Clay came to the valley on a Thursday in February, and he came the way trouble usually comes, dressed well and smiling. Martha saw him from the kitchen window first, a hired buggy better than anything Millhaven kept in its livery, coming down the valley road at a pace that said the driver was confident of his welcome. The man who stepped down into the yard was somewhere past 50, thick through the middle, with a good coat and a hat that had cost real money and the particular ease of movement that belongs to men who have spent years being accommodated. He had a broad, practiced smile, and he used it immediately when Samuel came out of the barn. Martha dried her hands and stayed at the window. She could not hear the conversation from the kitchen. She watched Samuel's body language, instead, the way his shoulders set when Clay began talking, the way he crossed his arms across his chest. In the third minute, the way he shook his head twice in a row, and then once more with a finality that was visible even from 50 yards. She watched Clay's smile stay in place through all of it, which told her more about Clay than anything else could have. A man whose smile does not change when he is being told no is a man who has not yet started trying. Samuel came inside after Clay's buggy had gone back up the valley road. He stood at the kitchen table and looked at the surface of it for a moment without sitting down. "Land broker," he said, "wants to buy the ranch. Railroad's coming through the valley, and he's been buying up claims ahead of it." What did you tell him?" she said. "Same thing I'll tell him every time he comes back," Samuel said. He pulled out the chair and sat down. "No." Martha set coffee in front of him. "How many of the other ranchers have sold?" He looked up. "Most," he said. "Hendricks, the Boyle brothers. Caulfield sold in January." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "This valley won't look the same in 5 years." "But you're not selling." "My father lost his land," Samuel said. The words were even without drama, but they carried weight she recognized. "I don't intend to." She nodded. She went back to the stove. She thought about the smile that had not changed. She thought, this is not finished. She was right. Clay came back twice more in February, each time with a higher number, written on a piece of paper that he slid across the table with the air of a man performing a kindness. Samuel slid it back both times. The third visit Clay left without the smile, and Martha, watching from the window, thought that was when the real trouble would begin. It began in March. The first sign was the feed merchant in Millhaven, a man named Hobart, who had been supplying the prior ranch for 6 years. He sent a brief note with the supply wagon, saying that he was no longer able to extend credit to the ranch and would require full payment in advance for future orders. Samuel paid because he had the money, but the cash reserve it required meant less flexibility going forward. The second sign was the seed supplier in Castor Creek, who sent word through a passing rider that his stock for the season was already committed, and he could not fill the prior order. The third sign was the hardware merchant who had always sharpened Samuel's equipment and repaired his tools. He sent his boy out with Samuel's last piece of work and a note saying he was too busy for new commissions. Martha watched each of these arrive over the course of 2 weeks, and she added them up the way she added everything up carefully and without comfort. "It's Clay," she said one evening. She said it plainly because Samuel needed to hear it plainly, and was the kind of man who respected that. "He's using his connections with the merchants. He's cutting off your supply lines." Samuel looked at her across the table. His face was tired in a way it had not been in December. "I know," he said. "What can you do without the feed through summer?" "Manage," he said. "I've got grazing land. The hay from last fall. It'll be tight, but it won't break us." He paused on the word us in a way she did not think he noticed, and she did not point it out. The water's the thing. The water was the thing. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of the prior land came down from the mountains, through a narrow canyon that crossed 3 miles of land owned by a man named Rourke, who had sold to Clay in January. The creek had always run freely because the arrangement between Pryor and the previous owner had been a handshake, one the kind that holds as long as decent men are on both sides of it. Clay was not a decent man. In the second week of March, Samuel rode out to check the creek in the north pasture and came back with mud on his boots and a look on his face that Martha had not seen before. It was not anger, precisely. It was a contained, deliberate stillness that was in some ways more serious than anger. "He's damned it," Samuel said. Up in the canyon, stacked rock and timber across the channel. He sat down at the kitchen table. "Creek's down to a trickle in the north pasture. Another 2 weeks, and the cattle won't have enough to drink." Martha sat down across from him. Outside, the March wind was working along the eaves of the house, and the dog lifted its head from the floor, and then put it back down. The kitchen smelled of the bread she had been making, and the smell of it seemed suddenly out of place, too ordinary, for the weight of what was sitting between them. "He can do that legally," Samuel said. "He owns the land the creek crosses. There's nothing in writing that says he can't divert it." He looked at his hands on the table. "I can try to drill for a well. There might be water under the south pasture, but that takes time and money, and if I'm wrong, I've spent both for nothing." Martha looked at the bread rising on the counter. She looked at the account book on the shelf. She thought about Hobart's note, and the seed supplier, and the hardware merchant, and the dam in the canyon, and she arranged all of it into the shape it actually was. "He's not trying to make you leave," she said slowly. "He's trying to make you unable to stay. There's a difference." But she met Samuel's eyes. "He wants it to look like the ranch failed on its own, not like he pushed it." "Neat." Samuel looked at her. "That means he's being careful," she said. "Careful men leave evidence." That night was the first night Samuel told her to leave. He did not mean it the way it sounded. She understood that even in the moment, understood it, the way you understand a thing when you have your own experience of fear, wearing the mask of coldness. But understanding it did not make it land any softer. They had finished supper, and she was washing the dishes when he said it. He said it to her back, which told her he could not quite make himself say it to her face. "You ought to think about going back to Mill Haven," he said. "Or somewhere. This is going to get worse before it gets better, and there's no call for you to be in the middle of it." She set the dish she was washing back in the basin. She turned around. He was looking at the table. The lamp threw shadows across the lines of his face, and he looked older than he had in the fall. And she thought about his father's land in Kansas, and Eleanor taking the stage north, and the account book left open on the table, and the boot prints in the frost, and she felt something rise in her that was not quite anger, and not quite grief, but was made of both. "No," she said. He looked up. "I am not leaving," she said. The words came out level and clear, the way words come when they have been waiting somewhere inside you for long enough. "I have spent 4 years in a town where people looked at me like I was something to be pitied or dismissed, and I did not leave then, and I will not leave now." She held his gaze across the kitchen. "You want me to go because you're afraid. I understand that, but I am not Eleanor Samuel, and this is not 3 years ago, and if you push me out the door because you can't bear the thought of watching me choose to stay, then you are making a very serious mistake." Maitine. The kitchen was very quiet. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. The lamp flickered once. The dog's tail moved against the floor. He said, "I don't want you hurt." "I know," she said, "but that is my risk to take, not yours to decide." He looked at her for another long moment, and then he looked away, and the set of his shoulders changed in a way she had learned to read. the particular release of a man who has been holding something rigid and has let it go. He did not tell her to leave again, but that night after she had gone upstairs, he sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time. She could see the faint line of lamplight under her door. She lay in the narrow bed and listened to the creek, diminished now from what it had been in the fall, running lower over its stones. And she thought about water finding its way through rock, and what it took to stop a thing that was meant to flow. She got up. She lit her candle. She opened her worn notebook to a fresh page. She had been noticing things since Clay's first visit, the way she noticed everything quietly and without announcement. She had been noticing because she was a woman, and a woman of her particular station in life had learned that being invisible had its uses. No one paid close attention to the hired help. No one guarded their conversations when the washerwoman was in earshot. Clay's men came through Millhaven regularly. They ate at the hotel dining room and drank at the saloon on Marsh Street, and they talked the way men talk when they are confident and comfortable and have no reason to lower their voices in front of someone who does not matter. She had been to Millhaven twice, since February, both times for supplies. She had sat in the feed store and waited while Hobart pretended to be busy, and she had listened. She had stood at the dry goods counter and listened. She had sat on the bench outside the post office in the thin March sun and listened to two of Clay's men eating their noon meal on the steps of the hotel across the street, their voices carrying in the still air. She had written things down, dates, names, specific words that men use when they are bragging about what they have arranged. She had a name, a federal water rights assessor named Dugan, who had been appointed by the territorial office to oversee water use disputes in the county, and who had signed off on Clay's acquisition of the Rourke land with a speed that the law did not require and that suggested something beyond professional efficiency had changed hands. She had a date in December when Clay had met privately with two members of the county land board in a back room of the Millhaven Hotel, a meeting that had not appeared in any public record, but that the hotel's day girl had mentioned to another woman in an unguarded moment. She had a letter. She had found it, or rather, she had found a reference to it in a torn piece of paper that had blown against the feed store fence on her second trip to town. It was half a letter unsigned discussing arrangements that had been made regarding the creek diversion and the regulatory review that should have preceded it but had not. The language was careful, but not careful enough. She had kept the torn paper. It was pressed flat in the back of her notebook. She sat at the small table in her room in the candlelight and looked at what she had assembled over 6 weeks of paying quiet attention. And she thought about the meeting Clay was planning for the following month, the town meeting where he intended to present Samuel Pryor's debts and the failing ranch as evidence that the land should revert to creditor claims, which Clay held through a third party that did not obviously bear his name. She thought about the county land board and the assessor named Dugan and the back room of the Millhaven Hotel. She thought about the territorial circuit judge who came through Millhaven every 8 weeks and whose last visit had been in March. She picked up her pen. She wrote for 2 hours by candlelight, composing the letter very carefully, choosing each word for its precision and its legal weight, drawing on every account she had kept, and every figure she had added, and every conversation she had overheard, from the invisible position of a woman who did not matter. She sealed the letter before dawn. She addressed it to the office of the Territorial District Court, to the attention of the circuit judge, whose name she had found in the courthouse records on her last trip to town. She did not tell Samuel. She mailed it on a Tuesday when she went for flour, dropping it at the post office window while the postmaster's back was turned, her face arranged in its customary expression of unremarkable practicality. On the ride back out to the valley in the hired wagon, with the flour sack at her feet, and the early April sky wide and pale above the grassland, She thought about what she had done and whether it would be enough. She thought about Samuel drilling for water in the south pasture, his figure small against the brown grass, the sound of the drill carrying across the valley in the cold air. She thought about the herd thinning toward the fence line where the creek ran low. She thought about the account book and the dwindling cash reserve, and Clay's smile that did not change. She thought about boot prints in the frost. She had one more thing she intended to do, and it was the riskier of the two. And she had not fully decided how to do it yet, but she was working on it the way she worked on everything steadily and without noise, and she would be ready before Clay's meeting came. What she had not counted on, and what she would not learn until the morning of the meeting itself, was that the circuit judge had not simply received her letter and filed it away. He had written back. His letter was waiting at the Millhaven post office on the Tuesday before Clay's meeting, and when Martha unfolded it and read the 2 careful paragraphs inside, standing at the post office counter with the postmaster pretending not to watch her, she felt something shift in the weight she had been carrying since February. It was not relief. Not yet. But it was the particular feeling of a door that has been locked for a long time, turning just slightly, under a steady hand. She folded the letter. She put it in her coat pocket beside her notebook. She walked out into the April street with her chin level and her hands still, and she began to plan. The morning of Clay's meeting, Samuel told her to stay home. He said it at breakfast, not looking at her directly, turning his coffee cup in his hands the way he did when he had made up his mind about something, and was not entirely comfortable with it. He said the meeting was at the town hall at 2:00, and he intended to go alone and hear what Clay had to say, and respond to it as best he could. And there was no reason for her to make the trip. Martha put the biscuits on the table. She sat down across from him. She poured her own coffee. "All right," she said. He looked up mildly surprised by the absence of argument. "I'll ride in with you," she said. "I need flour." He looked at her for a moment. Something in her face must have been entirely unremarkable, because he nodded and went back to his breakfast, and that was the end of the conversation. She had her notebook in her coat pocket before he had finished hitching the wagon. Millhaven on a Tuesday, in late April, had the slightly festive quality of a town that expects to witness something. Martha had grown up around small towns, and she knew the signs. Men standing in doorways who would not normally stand in doorways. The saloon on Marsh Street doing a midday trade. A cluster of women near the dry goods store who were not shopping, but were positioned to see who came and went from the direction of the town hall. She noticed all of it from the wagon bench. She kept her face forward and her hands folded in her lap. Samuel pulled up at the livery, and she climbed down with her flour sack over her arm and said she would meet him at the hall. He gave her a look she did not acknowledge, and she walked toward the post office. And once she was past the corner of the feed store, she stopped and stood still for a moment in the thin April sun. She checked her notebook. She checked the letter in her pocket, the judge's letter, which she had read enough times to have memorized, but which she wanted the physical fact of, in her hands. She checked the folded papers she had added over the past 2 weeks, the torn piece of letter from February, the careful notes from 6 weeks of listening, the 2 receipts she had obtained from the hotel's day girl for a small sum that represented most of what she had saved from her wages. Everything was in order. She straightened her collar. She walked to the town hall. The room was full by the time she arrived. Ranchers and merchants and townspeople filled the rows of chairs, and at the front Vernon Clay stood beside a table spread with papers and maps, talking to 2 men she recognized from the county land board. His associate. A thin-faced man named Garrett, who had been his instrument in most of the supply chain pressure, stood to one side with a leather document case. Samuel was near the back, standing rather than sitting, his hat in his hands. He saw her come in. His expression said she had promised flour. Not this. She took a seat 3 rows from the back and opened her notebook to a page near the middle and appeared to be reviewing figures. Clay called the meeting to order. He was good at it. She would grant him that. He had the practiced assurance of a man who had done this in other towns, with other stubborn landowners, and had always gotten what he came for. He laid out the situation in terms that sounded almost sympathetic: the changing economy of the valley, the opportunities the railroad represented, the difficulty of maintaining a single-family cattle operation against the pressures of modern commerce. He spoke about Samuel Pryor with an air of genuine regret, as if Pryor's predicament were a natural misfortune rather than an engineered one. He produced a document showing Samuel's outstanding debts held by a creditor company called Consolidated Western Holdings, which Martha knew was Clay's instrument in all but name, that gave Clay legal standing to petition for land transfer in lieu of payment. He spread it on the table with both hands and looked out at the room with his unchanged smile. "I want to be clear," Clay said, "that I take no pleasure in this. Mr. Pryor has worked this land honestly, but the circumstances are what they are." The room was quiet. Martha looked at Samuel. He was very still, his hat turning once in his hands, and she knew that stillness. She knew what it cost him. She stood up. The room turned to look at her, and she saw the particular quality of the attention that moved through it, the recognition, the slight collective adjustment of expectation that happens when someone the room has categorized as unimportant does something unexpected. She walked to the front of the room. Clay's smile stayed in place, but something behind his eyes recalibrated. He said, "Mrs. Calloway, this is a matter for landowners and their legal representatives." "Dia must say." "Yes," she said. "It is." She opened her notebook on the table beside his papers. "Which is why it may interest the room to know that the water diversion Mr. Clay constructed on the Rourke land in March of this year was implemented without the mandatory federal assessment required under the Territorial Water Rights Act of 1874. The room was very quiet. She did not look at the room. She looked at her notebook, and she spoke in the same level tone she used for accounts for weather warnings, for informing a man that his calves were sick, and she knew how to help them. The assessment that should have preceded the diversion was signed by Territorial Water Assessor Gerald Dugan on December 14th of last year, 3 months before the diversion was built, and 2 months before Mr. Clay acquired the Rourke land. An assessment cannot legally precede the acquisition it pertains to. The signature on that document is therefore fraudulent. She set the torn letter on the table. This is a portion of a correspondence recovered in February discussing arrangements made in advance of the Rourke acquisition. I will note for the room that the language used is specific regarding the payment made to Mr. Duggan and the date on which it was made. She set the hotel receipts on the table. These receipts document a private meeting held in the back dining room of the Millhaven Hotel on December 9th between Mr. Clay, Mr. Garrett, and 2 members of the County Land Board. This meeting was not recorded in any public proceeding. The hotel's register and the day girl's written statement, which I have here, confirm the date, the participants, and the duration. Clay said, "This is ridiculous. These are the fabrications of a hired woman with a grudge." She looked at him for the first time. "You are welcome to say so to Judge Harlan Briggs," she said, "who is seated at the back of this room at my written invitation and who has been reviewing copies of everything I have just presented for the past 10 days. The room turned. In the last row, a compact man in a dark coat with a judge's seal on the document case at his feet raised his hand once in acknowledgement. The silence in the town hall had a different quality now. Martha had been in enough rooms to know the difference between the silence of a crowd that is waiting and the silence of a crowd that has just understood something. This was the second kind. Clay's smile was gone. Garrett took a step toward the document case on his side of the table, and Judge Briggs said from the back of the room, in a voice that required no amplification, "I would leave that where it is, Mr. Garrett." Garrett left it where it was. Martha closed her notebook. She gathered her papers with unhurried hands. She looked at the county land board members in the front row, both of whom were finding urgent reasons to study their boots, and she looked at Clay, who had the face now of a man recalculating a great many things at once. She said, "The circuit court will be opening a formal inquiry into the water diversion, the assessor's conduct, and the land board meetings. I expect Mr. Clay and Mr. Garrett will be receiving correspondence from Judge Briggs's office within the fortnight." She stepped back from the table. "In the meantime," she said, "I believe the matter of Mr. Pryor's land is no longer before this meeting." She walked back through the room to where Samuel was standing. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was not the measuring look of their first meeting, and it was not the careful look of the firelit evenings, and it was not the tired look of the hard weeks in March. It was the look of a man who has just seen something that has rearranged his understanding of the world in a fundamental way. She stopped beside him. She said quietly, "I'll wait outside." She went out into the April sun and stood on the town hall steps and listened to the sound of the meeting dissolving behind her, the particular noise of a room full of people reconsidering everything they thought they knew. Two of the women from the Methodist circle were standing across the street, Mrs. Aldridge, Mrs. Fitch with her market basket. Martha looked at them with the same steady level gaze she had been practicing for 4 years. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them looked away first. Samuel came out 10 minutes later. He stood beside her on the steps and looked out at the street. Judge Briggs came out after him and shook Samuel's hand and said that the inquiry would begin within the month and that the water rights matter would be resolved before summer. He nodded to Martha with a respect that was specific and unambiguous and went down the steps toward his horse. Clay and Garrett came out last. Clay with the face of a man who had lost something he had not believed he could lose, and they walked to their hired buggy without looking in Samuel or Martha's direction, and the buggy went up the street and around the corner and out of sight. Samuel was quiet for a long time. The street went on about its business around them, the particular business of a town that has witnessed something it will be discussing for years. Martha waited. She had learned over the winter that Samuel Pryor took the time he needed before he spoke, and that what he said when he finally spoke was worth waiting for. "How long?" he said at last. "Since February," she said. "Since his second visit." He was quiet again. "You didn't tell me," he said. "It was not an accusation." "No," she said, "because if I had told you, you would have worried, and worrying would have made you act, and if you had acted, Clay would have known someone was moving against him. He needed to believe he had already won." She paused. "Men like that get careless when they think they've won." Samuel turned to look at her. The April sun was on his face, and the lines around his eyes had the particular depth of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time. But his eyes were clear. "Martha," he said. She waited. He seemed to reach for words in the way he reached for most things carefully, without waste. He said, "I have been wrong about a great many things in my life. I was wrong to tell you to leave. I was wrong to think that what was mine to protect was mine alone." He looked at her steadily. "I don't aim to be wrong about this again." She held his gaze. He said, "I don't want you staying at the ranch as my hired help anymore." The April sun was warm on her shoulders. Down the street a wagon went past, and a child called out something to a dog, and someone somewhere was frying something that smelled of onions. And it was such an ordinary afternoon, she thought for something that felt this large. "What do you want?" she said. "I want you to stay," he said. as my wife, as my partner, as the person this land belongs to, alongside me. He held her gaze with the same direct steadiness that had characterized everything about him since the first morning in the yard. I know this valley is quiet, and I know it's far from town. I know what I'm asking, and I want you to choose it because you want it, not because there's nowhere else for you. If there are other places you want to go, I won't hold you. But if you'll stay, I aim to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have cause to wish you hadn't. The creek was running again by the time they got back to the valley that evening, the dam having been declared an illegal obstruction by Judge Briggs before they left town. Martha heard it before she saw it, the familiar sound coming up from the cottonwoods, fuller and steadier than it had been in months, running clean over its stones in the long evening light. She stood at the porch rail and listened to it. Yes, she said. She had said it to Samuel on the steps of the town hall simply and without ceremony, and he had taken her hand in both of his with a care that said everything he had not yet found the words for, and she had felt the warmth of that all the way home. She said it again now, to the valley and the creek and the mountains going amber in the last of the sun. Yes, they were married in the Millhaven church on the second Saturday in June, with the pastor who had watched Martha sit alone in the same pew for 4 years, presiding over a ceremony of modest size and considerable dignity. Mrs. Aldridge and Mrs. Fitch were in attendance and sat in the third row with expressions of careful approval that Martha found more amusing than anything else. Judge Briggs sent a letter of congratulation. The inquiry into Clay's conduct concluded that summer with a finding that returned full water rights to the Pryor Ranch and resulted in Gerald Duggan's removal from his assessor position. Clay relocated to Cheyenne and was not seen in the Garnet Valley again. The ranch changed in the years that followed, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the steady, accumulating way of things that are properly tended. The barn got a new roof in the second year. A kitchen garden went in along the south wall of the house in the third, and Martha grew tomatoes and beans and the medicinal herbs she had always kept in a tin, now transplanted into proper beds, where they came back every spring without prompting. The house that had been silent for 3 years became a house with voices in it, the voices of two people who had learned to talk to each other, and had found to their mutual quiet satisfaction that they had a great deal to say. They talked about the cattle and the weather and the accounts and the books that the Millhaven Lending Library occasionally sent out on the supply wagon. They talked, sometimes in the evenings, about Nebraska and Kansas, and the things that had been lost, and the things that had been kept. They did not talk often about the years before, about Thomas or Eleanor, about the waiting and the silence and the long work of surviving a particular kind of loneliness. But sometimes on winter evenings, when the fire was low and the snow was moving quietly past the windows, one of them would say something small and honest about those years, and the other would listen without flinching, and then they would go back to what they were doing, and the saying of it and the hearing of it was enough. On an evening 5 years after Martha had first come down that valley road, with a carpet bag and a tin of dried herbs, and the absolute determination not to beg, she was standing at the kitchen garden fence in the long summer light, looking out at the herd grazing in the north pasture. The creek ran in the cottonwoods below. The mountains were going rose and gold above the tree line. The dog was asleep in the grass, nearby, grayer around the muzzle than he had been, but still present, still serious. She heard Samuel's boots on the porch behind her, and then his hands were at her shoulders, and he stood behind her. And they looked out at the valley together in the particular comfortable silence of two people who have run out of the need to fill silences. Her hands rested on the fence rail. They were still strong hands, still marked by the years of work, the calluses and the weather, and the evidence of what she had done and kept and built. They were not the hands of a woman who had been diminished. They were the hands of a woman who had carried what needed carrying, and had put it down when something better came along to carry instead. "Good evening," Samuel said into her hair. "It is," she said. The sun went down behind the mountains, and the first stars came out over the valley, and the creek ran on.